Just a nurse. That's what Dr. Sterling had called her 3 months ago, standing in the break room while Katie restocked the supply cart. Not to her face. Never to her face. But loud enough that everyone heard. She'd kept her hand steady, kept her eyes on the gauze packages, kept breathing like someone who didn't just absorb a blade between the ribs. Just a nurse. The words had hung in the fluorescent air like something with weight. Nobody at Oak Creek Memorial knew that Katie Morrison had carried a dying man 4 miles through Tikrit gunfire in 2009. Nobody knew her real name was tattooed on someone's forearm. Nobody knew that the woman in the coffee-stained scrubs who worked the night shift had held 17 lives together with her hands before most of them were even born. They didn't know. And Katie had spent 14 years making sure they never would. The night shift started at 11 p.m., and Katie arrived early like always. Oak Creek Memorial's ICU smelled like antiseptic and floor wax, that particular chemical clean stench that made the back of her throat tight. The fluorescent lights hummed their endless 60 Hz drone above her head, and she moved through the ward with the kind of economy of motion that came from muscle memory, from a lifetime of conserving energy, from knowing that you never knew when you'd need to run. Her brown hair was pinned in a tight bun. Her name badge hung crooked on her chest. Her scrubs bore the rings of 3 cups of cold coffee from the evening shift she'd covered. The overhead ventilator in room 4 wheezed its mechanical rhythm. The monitor in room 7 beeped in steady time. Normal night sounds. Normal night. She clocked in at 10:53 p.m. and settled into the rhythm that had become her life, for checks, vitals, labs, documentation. The quiet work of someone nobody watched. At 2:07 a.m., the ambulance bay doors hissed open and the night broke into movement. Incoming. Trauma. The intercom crackled, Bay 3, inbound 5 minutes, triple amputee, blast trauma, pulmonary contusion, ETA 2 minutes. Katie's hands didn't stop what they were doing. She was finishing a dressing on Mrs. Chen in room 6, and she finished it before she moved. That was the discipline. That was the rule she'd learned in another life: finish the task in front of you, then move to the next one. The movement of a machine. The movement of someone with nothing left to lose. The ambulance arrived at 2:14 a.m. She was in the hallway when they wheeled the stretcher through, boots on tile marking the rhythm. 1, 2, 3, 4. The paramedic was calling vitals to the charge nurse, 38-year-old male, IED detonation, amputation right above knee, amputation left at ankle, partial amputation right arm, shrapnel embedded in left lung, conscious, alert, BP holding at 118/74 on 2 liters of ONEG, pain controlled with fentanyl patch. Katie saw the right forearm first. That's what caught her. The tattooing was faded from time and sun exposure, but the letters were clear against pale skin, E.K.L. Morrison. The world didn't stop. The night didn't pause. But Katie's hands, steady as surgical steel for 38 years, trembled for exactly 3 seconds while she read her own initials on a dead man's arm. Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb, the chart said. The man she'd carried through a city that was trying to kill them both. The man whose blood had soaked through her uniform and mixed with Iraqi sand that still lived in the laces of the combat boots in her locker. The man whose name she'd thought she'd never see again because the name she'd given him that night was supposed to be a name of comfort, not resurrection. She steadied her breathing. 1 count in. 4 counts hold. 1 count out. The breathing of a woman who had learned that panic was a luxury. The ICU assigned him to room 3. Katie helped transfer him from the ambulance stretcher to the hospital bed, supporting his remaining limbs with hands that knew exactly how much pressure to apply, where the brakes would be. The patient was sedated, morphine hazy, eyes closed. Just as well. If he looked at her, if he saw her, if he recognized the hands that had dragged him backward under fire, the entire structure of her life would collapse like a building made of cards. Dr. Sterling arrived at 6:33 a.m., his Italian loafers clicking against the tile in that particular rhythm of authority. His sultan pepper hair was combed exactly right. His white coat was pressed. He was the kind of man who had never doubted himself and never would, because doubt required the kind of self-awareness that privilege erased. He reviewed Marcus Webb's chart, the papers making a crisp sound as he turned them. His mouth tightened. Katie was drawing labs when Sterling emerged from the room. She felt him before she saw him, that heaviness in the air that happened when power decided to occupy space. "That patient in 3, he said. His voice was quiet, which made it worse. Quiet voices carried authority. Loud voices just carried volume. "Transfer him to Augusta. The VA hospital can manage long-term amputee care. This is beyond our scope." Katie's hand was steady as she capped the blood tube. "He won't survive transport." Sterling didn't look at her. He was already moving, already turning away. Respiratory status. Pulmonary contusion with active shrapnel embedding. Katie's voice was low, measured, the voice of someone reading a grocery list. Not the voice of someone whose entire body was vibrating at a frequency that nobody could hear. Hypoxia risk during movement. Current O2 sat 94%. Dropped to 90% and we're looking at acute respiratory distress. He decompensates in transit. Not our problem, then. Sterling's loafers kept clicking down the hallway, away from her, away from Marcus Webb, away from anything that might complicate his afternoon. Katie's hand gripped the edge of Webb's bed so hard her knuckles went white. The metal rail was cold under her palm. In the bed, the man with her initials tattooed on his arm breathed shallow through the oxygen cannula, each breath a battle against shrapnel-damaged lungs, and Katie understood in that moment with the clarity of someone who'd already made peace with death that she was going to have to choose. She could follow protocol. Transfer the patient. Let him become someone else's responsibility. Let the senior chief petty officer who'd carried him stay buried beneath the surface of a nurse named Katie Morrison who nobody ever thought about twice. Or she could remember who she'd been, and accept what that meant. The next voice she heard was her own, 3 seconds of silence later, calling the charge nurse over. "Get me a portable ultrasound. I need to assess for effusion before we move him anywhere." And there it was, not a request. A command. The voice of someone who knew what she was doing, and didn't care who noticed. The charge nurse, Michelle, froze. That wasn't Katie's voice. That wasn't the tone. That was something else entirely. That was someone used to being obeyed. "Katie," Dr. Sterling said. Dr. Sterling isn't the one assessing pulmonary status. Katie was already moving toward the ultrasound machine, her hands moving with the precision of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. Not in a hospital. Not in Savannah, Georgia. But muscle memory didn't care about geography. Muscle memory just remembered. "Get me the machine. 2 minutes. I'll have a better picture of what we're dealing with." Michelle got the machine. And Katie began the careful work of looking at Marcus Webb, really looking at him, with the eyes of someone who'd once kept him alive in an alley in Tikrit, watching his chest rise and fall, counting the seconds between heartbeats, waiting for the sound of trucks that would mean they were found. She didn't tell him who she was. She didn't have to. Not yet. For now, she just had to keep him alive. For now, she just had to remember that sometimes the bravest thing you could do wasn't wearing a uniform or holding a gun. Sometimes it was just staying. The first refusal came on day 1. Dr. Harrison Chen, pulmonary specialist from the hospital across the street, took Sterling's call at 8 in the morning. Katie stood near the supply cart, restocking epinephrine vials, when Sterling's voice carried through his office door, not loud, just clear enough to carry weight. "Marcus Webb, triple amputee, severe respiratory compromise, cardiac involvement, I wouldn't touch it. Massive liability exposure." A pause. Then Sterling's practiced laugh, the kind that made colleagues feel included in something exclusive. By noon, Dr. Sarah Feldman from St. Catherine's declined. Then Dr. James Morrison, no relation, from Mercy General. 3 refusals before lunch, each one citing identical language, too complex, too risky, experimental protocols outside departmental guidelines. Katie knew what she was watching. She'd seen coordinated operations before. This was one. By day 3, the rejections had accelerated to a rhythm that felt less like coincidence and more like architecture. Dr. Sterling called his counterparts like a conductor tuning an orchestra. He sat in his office with the door open now, performing his competence for anyone within earshot. Webb's presenting with shrapnel-embedded lung tissue and pericardial effusion, he'd say, his tone suggesting these complications were insurmountable rather than treatable. Cardiac catheterization would be catastrophic. His heart can't handle the strain. What he never mentioned was that he'd instructed the admissions team not to schedule the echo he himself had ordered, ensuring the cardiac imaging remained incomplete. No complete picture meant no informed refusal, only the theoretical refusal of a case no one had actually examined. 5 more doctors said no. Then 7. Then 10. Each one armor-plated by Sterling's reputation, by the consensus he'd manufactured like a general positioning troops. 15 refusals by day 6. Katie counted them in her head while running labs, while adjusting for rates, while her hands performed their work and her mind tracked the siege. The break room on day 7 at 1:30 held 8 nurses on their lunch breaks. Katie pushed through the swinging door with her sandwich in a brown paper bag, the paper already damp from her trembling hands. She'd stopped eating much. Anxiety metabolized meals before they reached her stomach. She was selecting a chair, the one at the far end of the table, the one that belonged to whoever arrived last, when the movement started. Not coordinated, not obvious. Just a collective decision made without a single word. One nurse finished her salad and stood. Another drained her coffee. A third suddenly remembered she needed something from her locker. Within 90 seconds, the room had emptied except for the sound of forks being gathered. One nurse dropped hers deliberately on the tile floor, the metal clattering loud enough to make the fluorescent light seem to flicker in response. She didn't pick it up. She left it there as punctuation to a sentence spoken in silence. Katie unwrapped her sandwich and chewed without tasting anything. The bread felt like cardboard in her mouth. Her hand shook slightly around the paper wrapper, and she gripped it tighter, the craft paper crinkling against her palms. She forced herself to swallow. She forced herself to sit there for the full 30 minutes of her break, alone at a table that suddenly seemed enormous. The unit board hung outside the medication room, where every staff member had to pass it multiple times per shift. Katie's write-up was laminated in clear plastic, printed in 18-point font, positioned directly above the shift assignments where no one could miss it. The header was printed in bold, Katie Morrison, insubordination, repeatedly advocating for unapproved patient care. It was signed by Dr. Sterling and countersigned by the nursing director. Katie had received the formal notice in her email inbox at 7 in the morning, but seeing the physical documentation mounted on the board made something abstract suddenly concrete. This wasn't a conversation. This was a declaration. Every nurse who passed the board slowed slightly, reading it. Some made eye contact with Katie afterward, the kind of look that exists between people acknowledging something they can't speak about. Others simply stared straight ahead, their bodies moving carefully to create distance. By day 9, Sterling had accumulated 20 refusals. 20 board-certified physicians from 4 different hospitals, each one declining Webb's case with eerily similar language. Katie had started mentally counting them like rounds in a magazine, each refusal clicking into place like ammunition. 20 was the number Sterling needed. 20 meant consensus. 20 meant no court would blame him for refusing treatment. 20 meant his liability was distributed so widely that Katie's insistence on intervention would be perceived not as heroism but as hubris. On the morning of day 9, Sterling appeared in Webb's room at 2 o'clock. Katie was adjusting the patient's oxygen delivery, checking the nasal cannula where it sat beneath his nose. Webb's daughter Sarah, 19 years old with her father's dark eyes, sat in the corner chair where she'd been sitting for days, watching everything. Sterling entered without knocking. His voice when he spoke carried the controlled precision of a man who'd already won a fight he'd engineered before it started. "You're an embarrassment to this hospital, Katie. He didn't say Nightingale here, not in front of Sarah, but the nickname hung in the air anyway, whispered by every resident who'd repeated it in his presence. 20 doctors, actual board-certified physicians, have reviewed this case. 20 different specialists from 4 different hospitals. And do you know what they all concluded? Katie's hands continued their work, her movements measured and exact. She adjusted the oxygen flow rate from 2 liters to 2.5. She checked the pulse oximeter on Webb's left index finger. Everything she did was visible and undeniable. They all understood something you're apparently too dense to grasp: this patient is unsalvageable. Sterling stepped closer. Every complication you see is a reason for standard palliative care, not experimental heroics. Your insistence on treatment protocols we haven't approved isn't devotion to your patient. It's insubordination wrapped in sentiment. Webb's eyes tracked the conversation slowly, his morphine drip managing his pain but not his awareness. He understood enough to know he was being discussed. He understood enough to feel the weight of what was being said. A single tear formed at the corner of his left eye, not from the content of Sterling's words but from the helplessness of lying still while others decided his fate. Katie's jaw clenched slightly. One muscle at her temple flickered once, twice. A single tear escaped her own right eye. She hadn't expected it, hadn't controlled it. Her vision blurred for a microsecond. She wiped her eye with the ball of her thumb, the gesture quick and clinical, and when she turned to face Sterling, her gaze was steady. There was no apology in it. There was no retreat. Her voice when she spoke was barely above a whisper, but every word carved itself into the air like stone. 20 doctors can walk away, but I'm still his nurse, and I'm not going anywhere. Sterling's face transformed. The controlled smile vanished. His jaw tightened. For a moment, he looked like a man watching something he'd engineered spin beyond his control. He pointed toward the door, his hand shaking slightly with anger he was forcing back down. We'll see about that. I guarantee we'll see about that. He turned and left. Sarah watched her mother wipe her eyes, watched Katie's jaw remain set despite the moisture that had escaped, watched her stay beside the bed while Sterling's footsteps retreated down the corridor. The thing Sterling didn't understand, the thing no one understood about people who'd operated under fire, who'd made decisions with lives hanging on every second, was that tears weren't weakness. Tears were data. Tears meant you cared enough to have something to lose. Katie had walked through worse than a surgeon's contempt. She'd watched friends bleed out on desert sand. She'd made choices that haunted her at 3 in the morning. She could handle a laminated write-up and the silent treatment in the break room and 20 refusals. What she couldn't handle was letting Marcus Webb die without a fight. That night, Katie worked a double shift. By midnight, she'd been awake for 19 hours. The ICU settled into its particular rhythm of night operations, monitors beeping in patterns that became almost musical, ventilators cycling with rhythmic whooshes, the occasional overhead page calling for a rapid response team somewhere in the building. Webb's condition had begun deteriorating subtly. His oxygen saturation, which had been holding at 92%, had drifted down to 88%. His heart rate had climbed from the 80s to the low 110s. These were the kinds of changes that happened slowly enough that a less attentive provider might miss them. Katie didn't miss them. She made notes in his chart. She ordered repeat blood work. She documented everything meticulously because she knew Sterling was reading her notes, knew every action she took was being evaluated for mistakes he could leverage. At 2 in the morning, during her break, Katie sat in the chair beside Webb's bed in the dimmed room. The monitor's glow provided the only light, casting everything in shades of blue and green. Webb's eyes were open, tracking her face with the slow awareness of someone whose consciousness lived at the intersection of medication and trauma. His voice came out raspy, pulled from a throat that had been through hell. "Why are you fighting for me?" Katie didn't answer immediately. She adjusted his bag, checked the drip rate, performed the small rituals of nursing that filled silence. Webb's left arm moved slowly. He lifted his forearm, the one with the tattoo, holding it where she could see it clearly in the monitor light. Had a medic in Tikrit. 2009. IED got me bad. Someone carried me 4 miles under fire. Never saw her face clear, blood in my eyes, shock. She kept saying keep breathing, stay with me. Katie's hand stilled on his for tubing. Only thing I remember clear is her name on her vest, K. Morrison. The machines around them seemed to quiet. Katie's voice when it came out was barely audible, I'm sure she knows. Webb coughed, the sound wet and deep, his lungs struggling against the damage they'd sustained. Wherever she is, she's probably still saving people. That's who she was. Katie stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. I need to check your labs. She walked into the hallway, pressed her back against the wall outside his room, and covered her mouth with both hands. Sarah found her there 5 minutes later. Webb's daughter had been sleeping in the waiting room and had come to check on her father during her own midnight wakefulness. She found Katie in the hallway, breathing slowly, her shoulders rising and falling in controlled patterns. Sarah was old enough to understand that some things couldn't be fixed with questions, but she asked anyway, why does Dr. Sterling hate you so much? Katie's voice was flat when she answered, the emotion pressed down under layers of professional detachment. Because I won't let your father die quietly. Sarah's eyes filled. She was 19, a sophomore at Savannah State, still learning that the world preferred polite suffering to messy resistance. Neither will I. They stood there together in the hallway, two women who barely knew each other, unified by something that transcended the hospital hierarchy or Sterling's 20 refusals. Webb's heart monitor beeped steadily from the room behind them, a sound like water dripping in darkness, each beat a small victory against entropy. Katie's apartment smelled like stale coffee and the ghost of the life she'd built to stay invisible. 2 rooms. No photographs. A mattress on the floor with military precision corners. The only decoration was a pair of combat boots beneath the bed, their leather cracked like old scars, still holding the weight of Tikrit sand that wouldn't wash out no matter how many times she'd tried. She hadn't slept in 37 hours. Double shifts at Oak Creek Memorial had become her entire existence, 12 hours on, for hours in the nurse's lounge on a cot that smelled like Lysol and other people's desperation, then 12 more hours watching Marcus Webb's body betray him one vital sign at a time. The hospital owned her now. Not officially. Officially she was just a nurse. But Webb was different. Webb was the reason she'd become a nurse in the first place, to save people quietly, without the guns and the screaming and the names of the dead she couldn't forget. Webb's monitor showed his decline like a graph drawn in real time. Blood pressure trending down. Oxygen saturation following like a loyal dog into a dark room. Heart rate climbing. Always climbing. It was 0600 on Thursday when Webb's oxygen saturation dropped to 88%. Katie saw it on the monitor as she was checking his drip line, and something in her chest tightened the way it used to tighten in Tikrit when the air changed. When the atmosphere shifted from safe to seconds until everything ends. She adjusted the oxygen delivery from 6 liters to 8, watched the numbers crawl, 89. 90, 92. Better. Not good. Better. His heart rate climbed to 115 as if his body was running from something. Running toward something. She couldn't tell anymore which direction the danger was coming from. Michelle Webb appeared in the doorway at 0645, her father's daughter, with his eyes and his stubborn jaw. She'd been at the hospital for 9 days straight, sleeping in the waiting room chair, bringing her father ice chips and talking about a fishing trip they'd taken when he was still a man with all his limbs. Now she stood at the threshold of his room watching the machines do their mathematics of survival. Can you really save him? Michelle's voice was small. Smaller than a woman's voice should be, carrying the weight of every conversation where someone had told her no. Where doctors had used words like palliative and comfort care and we're doing everything we can, which everyone knew meant we're not doing anything anymore. Katie didn't look away from the monitors. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, checking the foresight, ensuring the line hadn't kinked, documenting vitals in the electronic chart with a precision that made every number feel like testimony. I can keep him alive, Katie said. That's what I'm here to do. He asked about you this morning. Michelle stepped into the room. When the fever broke for a minute. He said there was a name. On his arm. She pointed at the tattoo, K. Morrison in ink that had aged grey over 15 years. He said it was someone who saved him. Someone from the Navy. He couldn't remember if it was real or a dream from the morphine. Katie's jaw tightened. She didn't answer. The monitor beeped its steady rhythm, and she documented the trend, BP 98 60 seconds now, dropping. The number felt like a countdown. She wrote it in the chart with the clinical distance of someone reporting the weather. "We need cardiology to run an ultrasound," Katie said. "To check his pericardium. He's showing signs." "Signs of what?" "Cardiac tamponade. His heart's filling with fluid. We need imaging to confirm." Michelle reached for her father's hand, careful of the lines, and Katie paged cardiology for the 4th time that week. The phone rang back within minutes. "Hi, this is Dr. Henderson from cardiology. I understand you're requesting an ultrasound for the Webb patient." "Affirmative," Katie said. She used the formal language now. The language of certainty. Triple amputee, multiple shrapnel lacerations to the thorax, deteriorating vitals. Neck vein distension visible. Heart sounds muffled. I'm documenting a trend toward tamponade. There was a pause. The kind of pause that meant someone was checking something. Then, I'm going to have to decline. The patient's case is too complex for our current protocols. You'll need to escalate to ICU attending. That would be Dr. Sterling, Katie said. Yes. Talk to him. The line went dead. Katie stared at the phone. She'd already talked to Dr. Sterling. She'd already talked to 15 other doctors across 3 hospitals, 15 refusals in 11 days, each one a small death, each one another brick in a wall that was getting higher. 15 doctors who'd looked at Webb's chart and seen only liability. Only risk. Only a man not worth saving. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was watching Dr. Sterling orchestrate every single refusal with the precision of a conductor leading an orchestra through a symphony of no. He'd call colleagues at Emory. He'd call specialists at Memorial. He'd drop Katie's name like a weight around their necks, that nurse is pushing for unapproved treatment, she doesn't understand hospital policy, she's creating liability. By the time the 21st doctor hung up, Sterling had already poisoned the well so thoroughly that no one was willing to even look at the case file. Katie documented the cardiology decline at 08 for 7. She documented Michelle's tears at 0900. She documented Webb's blood pressure sliding to 96/58 at 1000, and then she paged Sterling directly, calling his office instead of using the hospital system so the conversation wouldn't be recorded. "Dr. Sterling, this is Katie Morrison in the ICU. We need to discuss Staff Sergeant Webb's cardiac status. I'm seeing pericardial signs that suggest..." "Morrison," Sterling's voice came through like ice water. "I've told you before. This patient's care is not your responsibility. You're a nurse. Act like one. He's in my care assignment. His vitals are declining. We need that echo. We need you to remember your place. You called cardiology 4 times this week without authorization. Do you understand what an authorized consultation looks like in a termination hearing?" The phone line hummed. Katie's fingers tightened on the receiver, but her voice stayed level. "I'm documenting clinical decline. You're overstepping. And I'm going to be very clear about this because I don't think you're understanding the seriousness of your situation. If you page another department about Marcus Webb, if you initiate any care protocol without my direct approval, I'm filing a formal complaint with the hospital board. Do you understand? You'll be finished here. Permanently finished. The nursing board will see to it." Katie set the phone down. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was steady. The mask she wore at work, the quiet deference, the anonymous competence, remained perfectly in place. "Understood, doctor," she'd said, and meant it in a way he couldn't possibly understand. But after she hung up, after she walked back to Webb's room and watched his oxygen saturation tick down to 91%, after she saw the subtle signs that no one else was documenting, the jugular venous distension that was barely visible unless you knew to look for it, the pulsus paradoxus that made his blood pressure drop 10 points with each breath. She began keeping a second set of notes. In a small leather notebook, tucked beneath her scrubs, Katie documented everything that Sterling had forbidden her from escalating. The declining pressures written in ballpoint pen. The heart sounds, that soft dullness that meant fluid where blood should flow freely. The neck veins that bulged slightly when Webb inhaled. The subtle signs that his pericardium was filling with blood at a rate that would eventually crush his heart. These were the notes she was not supposed to make. The observations she was not supposed to record. The clinical progression that existed nowhere in the official hospital record because a man in an office upstairs had decided that Marcus Webb was not worth the risk. Sarah found her at the supply station at 1200, reorganizing 4 bags with a precision that suggested she was trying to organize her thoughts the same way. "You look like you're going to snap something," Sarah said. "You've done 12 hours of overtime this week." "I'm fine," Katie said. "You're not fine. Nobody's fine. This thing with Webb and Sterling, it's all over the unit now. Michelle's crying in the waiting room. The other nurses won't even go in his room because Sterling made some comment about participating in unsanctioned care protocols." Sarah lowered her voice. "You know he's setting you up, right? He's documenting everything you do. Trying to prove you're unsafe." Katie didn't respond. She finished organizing the 4 bags, each one lined up with military precision, each one placed exactly as it was supposed to be placed. Because that was the job now. Not saving Marcus Webb. Just doing the job. Just being invisible. Just surviving the day so she could come back and do it again tomorrow. At 1600, Sterling called her into his office. His room was all mahogany and leather, the kind of space that said money and power and the certainty that authority would always be obeyed. He sat behind his desk like a general at a war table, and he smiled when she entered, the smile of a man who'd already won. "Katie, sit down," he said. She didn't sit. She stood at the threshold between the doorway and the carpet, a position that allowed her to leave if she needed to leave, though her face showed nothing of the calculation. "I'm reassigning you," Sterling said. "Effective immediately. Michelle Stanton is taking over Webb's care. You'll be reassigned to the post-op recovery wing. Better hours. Less stress. I think everyone would agree it's a good move for you." "Michelle works days," Katie said. Her voice was quiet. "Clinical. Webb needs continuous monitoring. He needs a nurse who follows orders. Something you've demonstrated difficulty with." Katie didn't flinch. Didn't argue. Didn't show the thing that was moving behind her eyes like a current beneath still water. She simply turned and walked to the unit clerk station, where her name was written on the assignment board next to Webb's room. She picked up the marker and erased it with 3 horizontal strokes, each one deliberate and final. Sarah caught up to her at the exit. "What happened? What did he say to you?" "Hospital policy," Katie said. That night, Katie sat in her apartment still wearing her scrubs, the fabric stiff with dried sweat and hospital air. She hadn't turned on the lights. She sat in darkness that felt natural to her, the kind of darkness that soldiers knew, the kind that didn't need explanation or comfort. Her phone rang 17 times that evening, numbers she didn't recognize, and she watched the screen flash without answering. At 0100, she couldn't stay still anymore. The apartment walls were closing in the way they did when she hadn't slept in too long, when the memories of Tikrit started bleeding through the medication and the routine and the careful civilian life she'd built. She grabbed her badge, the ID that still said Katie Morrison, ICU registered nurse, even though she wasn't supposed to be in the ICU anymore, and she drove to Oak Creek Memorial. The parking lot was nearly empty. The kind of empty that belonged to the hours between night and morning, when the hospital felt like a ship at sea with no land in sight. Katie sat in her car on the 3rd level, looking up at the ICU windows, looking for the light that indicated Webb's room. She found it, a dim glow behind closed curtains. She was about to turn the key in the ignition when the lights started flashing. Not the normal monitor lights. Not the routine beeping of vital signs. The urgent flash of a code blue, the kind that meant someone's heart had decided to stop being a heart and had become something else instead. Katie's hands moved before her mind caught up. She was out of the car. Her feet were moving toward the hospital entrance. Her badge was already in her hand. The security guard at the west entrance called out to her, "Visiting hours are over," but she was already past him, already moving through corridors she'd memorized in 9 days, already running toward the ceiling lights that said ICU, 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 like a prayer. The monitor screamed first. One continuous wail at 0253 hours. Katie was 3 floors down, in the break room, hands wrapped around cold coffee that had gone bitter 2 hours ago, when the alarm hit the speakers like a gunshot. Code blue, ICU 12. Webb's room. Her feet moved before her brain caught up. The west entrance guard called out as she passed, "Visiting hours are over," but she was already moving through corridors she'd memorized in 9 days, already running toward the ceiling lights that said ICU, 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 like a prayer. The room came into focus in stages. Michelle Stanton frozen at the bedside, mouth open. Webb's daughter Sarah gripping the bed rail. And Webb himself gray as concrete, his neck veins distended like cables, skin the color of storm clouds rolling across the Atlantic. The monitor showed the truth, 110/70. Then 100/65. Then 95/60. Then the numbers fell like dominoes. Pressure dropping. O2 sat climbing toward dangerous. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm, but it was fighting a battle it couldn't win. Katie's voice cut through the chaos, steady as a surgical laser. "What happened?" Michelle's voice shook. "He just crashed. I paged cardiology, but they're in another code, and I called Sterling, and..." Katie was already moving. Hands reaching for the ultrasound machine. Mind calculating. The symptoms matched the pathology she'd seen in Tikrit: shrapnel wounds, fluid accumulation, pressure building around the heart until the heart couldn't beat. Tamponade. Her hands knew what to do even before her mouth formed the word. Cardiac tamponade. Katie's voice was clinical, precise, void of the uncertainty that had haunted her for 9 days. "I'm doing a pericardiocentesis." Michelle stepped backward. "You're not authorized. Sterling said you were off his case." But Katie had already prepped the cardiac needle, already positioned the ultrasound probe. The screen showed the dark fluid collection surrounding Webb's heart like a noose tightening. She didn't hesitate. Couldn't afford to. In Tikrit, hesitation meant body bags. In this ICU, hesitation meant the same thing, just slower. The needle went in at the xiphoid process, the angle precise, her hand moving with the muscle memory of 12 field operations under fire. The ultrasound guidance showed her everything: the fluid, the pericardial sac, the exact depth. She advanced millimeter by millimeter. Felt the resistance. Felt the pop as the needle pierced the membrane around the heart. Dark blood filled the syringe. 50 cubic centimeters, 100 cubic centimeters, 150 cubic centimeters. Each withdrawal released pressure, allowed the heart to expand, allowed it to beat again. Sarah made a sound like a prayer. The monitor showed the immediate response. Pressure climbing. 70/40. 78/48. 85/50. Oxygen saturation stabilizing. The whole procedure took for minutes. For minutes to undo the damage of hours. Katie withdrew the needle, set it in the specimen cup, and pulled off her gloves as Webb's color returned to something approaching human. The monitor settled into a steady rhythm. 88/52. Not great. But alive. That's when Dr. Sterling arrived. He appeared in the doorway at 0307, summoned by Michelle's panicked text, and his eyes moved from Webb to the ultrasound machine to Katie's hands to the syringe filled with dark blood. His expression transformed like watching a storm cross the sky, a first shock, then comprehension, then a rage so cold it made the room temperature drop. "What the hell did you do?" His voice was quiet. Which was worse? Katie met his gaze. Met it without flinching, without the deference that had characterized every interaction for 9 days. Pericardiocentesis. He had acute cardiac tamponade. He would have died in another 3 minutes. His pressure was 60/40ths. Sterling's hands trembled as he pointed toward the door. You performed an unsupervised invasive procedure without physician authorization. You are not qualified. You are not credentialed. You are, his voice rose with each word. Off this patient's case. Get out. Now. You're done. Finished. Done. Katie set down the syringe carefully. Stripped off her gloves. Moved past Michelle, who stood crying in the corner. Moved past Sarah's broken voice calling after her, wait, Katie, thank you, but she didn't slow. Didn't acknowledge it. Couldn't afford to. The mask had to stay in place. The senior chief who just saved a man's life had to disappear back into the shadow of the nurse who'd never been anything at all. But that wasn't the worst part. By noon, Sterling had activated his network like a precision weapon. For calls to board members, each one carefully scripted, unsupervised invasive procedures, scope of practice violations, patient safety risk, his voice carrying the authority of 23 years at Oak Creek Memorial. Another call to Katie's nursing school requesting her clinical evaluations. A third call to the state nursing board filing a formal complaint. By 1 o'clock, an external review team had been mobilized. By 2 o'clock, they'd arrived at the hospital with notebooks and questions and the kind of official authority that made other administrators nervous. At 1,600 hours, a courier delivered the envelope. Katie sat in her apartment, bare walls, no photographs, nothing that spoke to who she'd been or what she'd done, and opened the termination letter with her name typed in 12-point Times New Roman. The hospital president's signature at the bottom. 3 words that ended everything, effective immediately. Gross violation of scope of practice. Insubordination. Unauthorized invasive procedure. Hospital policy forbids nursing staff from performing procedures outside their clinical authorization, regardless of patient outcome. She set the letter on the kitchen counter. Didn't read it twice. Didn't need to. The words were the same as every other time the world had decided she was too much, too broken, too willing to cross lines that respectable people didn't cross. At the hospital, she cleaned out her locker in silence. Took only what mattered. The pair of worn combat boots at the bottom, tread still holding Iraqi sand, dust she'd never quite managed to wash away. Sand from a place where a man had carried another man 4 miles through gunfire. Where she'd been whole. Where the nightmares made sense because the things she'd survived justified the cost. The drive home took 17 minutes. She parked in her driveway and sat without moving. 2 hours. The clock on the dashboard moving forward while everything inside her went perfectly, completely still. 3 days later, she sat in the intake office at the Veterans Affairs Hospital in Augusta, not as a nurse, but as a patient. The forms trembled in her hands. PTSD screening. Sleep disturbance. Combat exposure history. She was surrounded by veterans whose wounds she recognized because she'd treated injuries like them in another lifetime, in the version of herself she'd walked away from when the nightmares became unbearable. A man with a prosthetic leg sat across from her. She knew exactly how that prosthetic had come off. Knew the sound it made when it did. Knew what came next. The intake officer's voice was gentle. Have you had any suicidal thoughts? Katie's voice came out steady. Not yet. But that was before Thursday. Before 1,100 hours. Before the sound that made every head in Oak Creek Memorial's lobby turn toward the windows. The rotor wash came first, a thrumming that rattled windows on the 4th floor, scattered paperwork across the parking lot like autumn leaves, made the automatic doors swing open and closed in a panicked rhythm. Then the helicopter descended. Black Hawk. Military configuration. Its shadow passed over the building like judgment. The doors burst open at 1,102 hours. For Navy SEALs in full combat gear. Boots hitting tile in unison, step, 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 each footfall echoing through the lobby like a countdown. Rifles slung across chests. Tactical vests bearing unit patches. The kind of presence that made the air pressure change, made civilians instinctively step aside. The lead SEAL's voice carried through the emergency department, clipping off each word like rounds from an automatic weapon. "We're looking for Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Morrison." Dr. Sterling was near the nurse's station. His smirk died mid-formation. "There's no one here by that," he started. "Where is Senior Chief Morrison?" The SEAL didn't ask. Didn't request. Commanded. A nurse pointed toward the parking lot with a shaking hand. "Katie Morrison was fired 3 days ago." Sarah Webb pushed through the crowd, her voice breaking. "You mean she's a senior chief? In the military?" The lead SEAL ignored her. He handed Dr. Sterling a manila folder, thick, official, bearing the Department of Defense seal. Sterling's hands trembled as he opened it. His face went white. Then paler. Then a shade that suggested the oxygen wasn't reaching his brain. The SEAL's voice rose, filling the lobby, reaching the waiting room and the registration desk and the ICU monitoring station upstairs. "Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Morrison." 2 Navy crosses. Silence. For Bronze Stars with Valor. A nurse dropped her clipboard. Purple Heart. Served in Naval Special Warfare Command for 12 years. Deployed 6 times to combat zones. Credited with saving 17 lives during Operation Iraqi Freedom, Tikrit Sector, 2009. Primary mission, combat rescue and field medicine. Sarah's voice was barely audible. "She saved my father? In Iraq?" A second SEAL stepped forward, reading from a tablet with methodical precision. Senior Chief Morrison carried Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb for miles through active gunfire after an improvised explosive device severed both his legs and his right arm. She performed emergency amputation and hemorrhage control under fire, maintained his airway and circulation for 6 hours until medevac extraction. She was shot twice during the extraction. Remained operational. Did not leave his side. Dr. Sterling backed toward the stairwell like he could escape the words by walking away from them. The third SEAL continued. Senior Chief Morrison was recommended for the Medal of Honor. She declined all media recognition. She declined all formal ceremonies. She walked away from active duty 18 months ago due to service-related PTSD. She told no one, not family, not colleagues, not the Department of Defense, where she went. The fourth SEAL, younger than the others, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd seen what combat does to people, added one final sentence. She chose anonymity to heal. She chose silence to survive. And then the lead SEAL's eyes found Dr. Sterling's. "You fired a decorated combat veteran for doing what she's done her entire career. Saving lives when everyone else walked away." The FBI arrived at 1,120 hours. 2 agents in Navy suits, badges clipped to their belts, expressions blank as fresh concrete. They walked directly to Dr. Sterling, who'd been standing frozen near the surgical supply cabinet, the manila folder still in his trembling hands. The lead agent's voice was professional, devoid of emotion. "Dr. Richard Sterling, you're under arrest for attempted falsification of medical credentials and tampering with state licensing databases in violation of 18 U.S.C. Section 1028. Sterling's voice cracked. "What? I never? Our investigation shows you accessed the state nursing database using your hospital administrator credentials. You attempted to alter Katie Morrison's clinical certifications and license status to justify her termination. You also falsified performance reviews submitted to the state medical board. Is that correct?" "I was protecting hospital policy." Sterling's hands went up, palms out, as if he could talk his way out of this. Handcuffs clicked. Sterling screamed about lawyers and misunderstandings as the agents walked him through the lobby, past phone recording bystanders capturing every second, past nurses stepping back like he'd become contagious, past Sarah who watched with her mouth open and her father's name tattooed on her hands in the form of trembling fingers. The lead SEAL made a phone call from the parking lot. "Senior Chief, it's handled. We need you back." Dr. Sterling moved through the hospital like a precision instrument calibrated for destruction. By noon, 4 board members had received calls from his office, his voice measured, clinical, concerned. Unsupervised invasive procedures, he told them. Patient safety compromised. Nursing credentials in question. The calls were brief. Professional. Lethal. He contacted Katie's nursing school next, requesting her clinical evaluations, then summoned an external review team from the Georgia Medical Board to investigate her credentials. All of it scheduled. All of it documented. All of it designed to bury her beneath layers of institutional weight that no single nurse could move. Sterling wasn't loud about it. Loud people made mistakes. He was methodical. He was a machine grinding slowly forward, and machines don't stop because someone asks them to. Katie's termination letter arrived by courier at 1600. The hospital president's signature ran across the bottom, not Sterling's name, but his orchestration. Due to violations of hospital protocol regarding unauthorized invasive procedures and insubordination, your employment is terminated effective immediately. She read it once. Didn't read it again. The words didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that her ID badge no longer worked. What mattered was that when she tried to access the ICU at 16:30, the system rejected her twice, and she understood that the rejection was permanent. She cleaned out her locker in silence, watching the other nurses pretend not to watch. Someone had rearranged the break room during her shift. Her coffee mug was gone from the cabinet. She took only what was hers, the pair of worn combat boots hidden beneath her spare scrubs, the one still stained with Iraqi sand from a desert she'd promised herself she'd never think about again, and the one she couldn't throw away because they held memories that belonged to someone else now, someone she'd spent 18 months burying. She held those boots for a moment in the parking lot, the leather cracked like an old map, and then she walked to her car without looking back at the hospital. The sky was the color of wet concrete. Rain would come soon. 3 days later, she sat in the VA hospital waiting room in Augusta, 52 miles south, in a plastic chair that smelled like industrial cleaner and regret. Intake forms trembled in her hands, not from fear but from the effort of holding herself still. "Have you experienced nightmares related to combat deployment?" the form asked. "Yes." "Do you experience flashbacks during unexpected loud noises?" "Yes." "Have you considered harming yourself?" She left that one blank and moved to the next question. Around her, the waiting room held the accumulated damage of 20 years of war, a man missing his left leg, reading a magazine he wasn't looking at, a woman staring at nothing, her service dog pressed against her leg, an older veteran whose hand shook as he filled out the same forms Katie was filling out, both of them returning to a place that shouldn't have to exist but always does. These were her people now. Not the ones in scrubs anymore. Not the hospital. Not the place that had decided she was expendable. The nurse who called her name was younger, maybe 30, with a tattoo of a parachute on her wrist. Katie recognized the unit crest embedded in the design, 160th SAW Night Stalkers. "I'm going to need to know everything," the nurse said, her voice like someone who'd already heard the worst and could handle whatever came next. Katie began talking. The words came out in fragments at first, then in a flood. Tikrit, the IED, Webb's blood on her hands, the weight of him across her shoulders as she ran, the sound of rounds snapping overhead like angry insects. The nurse listened. Didn't interrupt. Didn't look shocked. Just took notes and occasionally said, "That makes sense." By the end of the appointment, Katie had cried twice. Once in the middle of describing the desert. Once at the end, for no reason she could identify, just the simple fact of sitting in a chair that wasn't judgment and speaking her truth to someone who understood what truth cost. What she didn't know, what no one in that waiting room knew, was that the video had already been uploaded. A bystander's phone had captured it all, Dr. Sterling in handcuffs, his hands behind his back, his suit jacket twisted from the force of the arrest, FBI agents on either side of him, and Sterling's voice, high and breaking, saying things that would live on the internet forever. "This is a mistake, I'm calling my lawyer, this is a goddamn mistake." The video went live at 18:47 hours on Wednesday evening. By Thursday morning, it had 2.3 million views. Nurses shared it on hospital forums. Medical ethics boards reposted it. Veteran advocacy groups made it their profile cover. The comment section filled with people typing things like "finally" and "where do I send flowers to Katie Morrison," and "this is what happens when you pick a fight with the military." Oak Creek Memorial released a statement at 1800, "Our institution is cooperating fully with federal investigators." Dr. Richard Sterling's employment has been terminated effective immediately. The hospital's legal team moved quickly, distancing themselves, making sure that when the dust settled, they'd be on the right side of it. Sterling's lawyer held a press conference the next morning in a downtown office building with too much glass and not enough hope. Sterling stood in a suit instead of scrubs, his face the color of old newspaper, and his lawyer read a statement: "My client made errors in judgment but acted always in the best interests of patient safety and hospital protocol." A reporter in the third row raised her hand. "Did you know Katie Morrison was a decorated Navy SEAL?" Sterling's voice cracked when he spoke. "She never disclosed her military service." "How was I supposed to know?" "How is any hospital administrator supposed to know?" Another reporter: "Faster, you called 20 doctors to ensure Marcus Webb wouldn't receive care." "Why?" Sterling opened his mouth. Closed it. Opened it again. Nothing came out. The silence in that room was the sound of a career collapsing, slow and inevitable, the way a building falls when the foundation cracks. The Georgia Medical Board suspended his license pending investigation. The FBI's forensic audit revealed 17 separate accesses to the state nursing database over 3 days, Sterling attempting to add fabricated disciplinary actions to Katie's record, altering performance reviews from exemplary to needs improvement in documents submitted to the board. Federal prosecutors charged him with falsifying government records, computer fraud, and obstruction. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Katie testified for 40 minutes, her voice steady as stone, describing how Sterling systematically denied a disabled veteran the care he needed. The jury deliberated for hours. Guilty on all counts. Sterling received 18 months probation, 500 hours community service, and a permanent medical license revocation, no possibility of reinstatement. The Georgia Medical Board declared it in language that sounded like a coffin closing. Dr. Sterling's actions represent a fundamental betrayal of medical ethics and patient advocacy. 18 months later, Sterling taught CPR certification at Savannah Technical College, earning $15 per hour, demonstrating chest compressions on rubber mannequins to students who checked their phones and asked questions he couldn't answer. A student raised her hand: "Weren't you a surgeon?" Sterling's jaw tightened. His hands, which had once held a scalpel with precision and power, now pressed down on plastic chest, counted compressions aloud, and felt nothing but the weight of what he'd lost. The sound of his voice in that classroom was thin, threadbare, a whisper instead of the surgical certainty that had once commanded respect. But that wasn't the end. That was just the beginning of the reckoning. Every classroom Sterling walked into, someone recognized him eventually. Every community college in Georgia knew his name because someone's daughter was a nurse, someone's son was active duty, and they'd all shared that video. The reviews appeared on Rate My Professor websites within weeks. Waste of time. Arrogant. He failed his patients when they needed him. Sterling read them all. He read every one, and they accumulated like small stones in a very large avalanche. Meanwhile, Katie Morrison's story traveled the opposite direction entirely, upward, outward, into military forums and medical ethics conversations and town halls where hospital administrators were suddenly being asked very specific questions about how they protected whistleblowers and whether they valued patient safety or liability protection more. The answer, it turned out, changed everything about what came next. If you've ever worked in an institution that failed someone you loved, or if you've ever wanted to speak up but stayed silent because the cost seemed too high, Katie's story is about why speaking up matters anyway. Subscribe for more stories about the people who save lives in the places where no one's watching, and comment below, what would you have done in Katie's position? Stay with us for the final segment, where everything transforms.